Charles, whatever it is, father agrees. Eleanor Bennet observed the doting expression Alexander King had for Charles King and couldn't help but sigh. No wonder the other princes envied Charles King. Father, I wish to invite Dr. Bennet to treat me. Eleanor Bennet looked at Charles King and immediately realized he was doing this on purpose. I must have been so careless, relying on physician you to oversee your treatment and forgetting the exceptional skills of Eleanor Bennet, Alexander King said with a laugh. Eleanor Bennet, starting tomorrow, you will be in charge of treating the Wing Prince's illness. With you and physician you, I trust Charles will recover. I will do my best. Eleanor Bennet accepted the order, inwardly cursing Charles King. So, every time physician you Daniel entered the palace, it was to treat him. Thinking about him, her heart involuntarily warmed a little. Your Majesty, concubine Florence requests an audience. Court eunuch Lee entered the hall to report. All right, summon her in. Alexander King leaned against the dragon bed, looking weary. I take my leave. Eleanor Bennet packed up her medical kit and withdrew just in time. As she stepped out of the hall, she came face to face with the stunningly beautiful concubine Florence. Greetings, concubine Florence. Eleanor Bennet knelt to pay her respects. Please rise, Dr. Bennet. Is His Majesty in good health today? Concubine Florence asked with a smile. His Majesty is in excellent health. Eleanor Bennet replied with a bow. Your Ladyship, His Majesty awaits you. Court eunuch Liam stepped forward to announce. Dr. Bennet, drop by the floral pavilion when you're free. Concubine Florence said before entering the great hall. Eleanor Bennet watched her figure disappear, her thoughts turning to the late concubine Violet and the Empress. Today, Alexander King's expression of guilt when mentioning the Empress didn't seem feigned. However, from ancient times, emperors were often fickle in love. No matter how deep their affection, new love would always overshadow the old. Dr. Bennet seems to particularly enjoy daydreaming. Charles King had appeared beside Eleanor Bennet without her noticing, his tone laced with provocation. The subject greets His Highness and has other matters to attend to. May I take my leave? Eleanor Bennet wished to depart quickly. Lord Bennet, this retreat to advance strategy of yours is indeed executed flawlessly. Charles King sneered coldly. This woman truly had a meticulous mind. Your Highness, the subject dares not misinterpret your words. Eleanor Bennet had already anticipated that her small ploy would not escape Charles King's sharp eyes. Lord Bennet is intelligent and resourceful, how could you not understand? My illness will trouble you in the future. Charles King let out a cold laugh. I will do my utmost. Eleanor Bennet knew he would use this tactic. That night at the hot spring, she realized he wouldn't let her go so easily. Watching his retreating figure, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but admire Charles King's acting skills. This man was truly petty. After all, she had saved him twice. The problem was, she didn't even know when she had offended him. She could only blame herself for meddling unnecessarily at the Golden Flower Temple. Feeling a pang of melancholy, Eleanor Bennet returned to the Imperial Medical Institute. As soon as she entered the Imperial Medical Institute, she saw several senior imperial physicians waiting in the courtyard, seemingly there for her. Currently, Eleanor Bennet was in charge of the institute, but they harbored dissatisfaction. They dared not voice it openly, constrained by the Emperor's authority. Are the esteemed gentlemen waiting for Eleanor Bennet? Eleanor Bennet spoke with authority, yet without anger. Lord Bennet, this old man is advanced in age and wishes to request a few days off to recuperate. The senior physician, surnamed Zhang, took the lead, clearly intending to make things difficult. Eleanor Bennet assessed the situation and merely smirked coldly. Do all the esteemed gentlemen wish to return home to recuperate? Eleanor Bennet's gaze swept coldly across the group. Indeed. The imperial physicians behind Zhang hesitated, casting sidelong glances at him. Eleanor Bennet understood this was Zhang's attempt to intimidate her. He knew that if the entire Imperial Medical Institute simultaneously requested leave, she would find herself in an impossible position. If the esteemed gentlemen are unwell, Eleanor Bennet will, of course, grant leave. However, the Imperial Medical Institute serves the sovereign, and negligence is unacceptable. If you are unwell while treating others, wouldn't that be Eleanor Bennet's oversight? Tomorrow, I shall report to His Majesty. Perhaps it would be better for the esteemed gentleman to retire and return home permanently. What do you think? Eleanor Bennet observed their reactions. Upon hearing the phrase, retire and return home, their faces turned pale. She knew well that these old men were reluctant to give up their lucrative positions at the Imperial Medical Institute. Lord Bennet, this humble subject is perfectly fine. No need for your concern. The imperial physicians quickly changed their tone. Oh! Are the esteemed gentlemen truly all right? Eleanor Bennet deliberately pressed. Truly, no issues at all. The imperial physicians nodded in unison. Physician Zhang, what about you? Eleanor Bennet turned her calm gaze toward Physician Zhang. Your humble servant thanks the kind intentions of Your Excellency Bennet, but this old official truly wishes to retire and return to my hometown. Imperial Physician Zhang looked at Eleanor Bennet with eyes full of resentment. He could not accept being defeated by such a young woman. This humiliation was too much for him to swallow. Given his position at the Imperial Medical Institute, even the Emperor might not agree to let him retire. Eleanor Bennet had already guessed his petty schemes. She hadn't expected this old man to be so difficult to deal with. If Imperial Physician Zhang wishes to retire and return to his hometown, this prince will grant the request on behalf of the Emperor. Edward King's voice rang out as he entered the scene, though no one had noticed when he arrived. Eleanor Bennet was slightly startled as she glanced at him. How long had he been there? How much had he seen of what had just transpired? Your servant pays respects to His Highness, Prince Jing. Everyone bowed their heads in greeting. Imperial Physician Zhang's face alternated between red and white upon seeing Edward King. Imperial Physician Zhang, your years of service have indeed been arduous. Such a small request need not trouble the Emperor, Edward King said as he approached Eleanor Bennet, his smile warm and reassuring. This old servant thanks His Highness, Prince Jing, for his understanding. Imperial Physician Zhang had not anticipated Prince Jing's sudden appearance, and the outcome of the day was entirely beyond his expectations. He could only accept the order and express his gratitude. The others present also realized their own impropriety and gradually took their leave. It became clear to them that the Bennet family's daughter was not someone they could afford to provoke. Eleanor Bennet thanks His Highness, Prince Jing, for coming to her aid. Eleanor Bennet bowed respectfully once the others had departed. This prince merely happened upon the scene by chance. These old men always think too highly of themselves. Today, you've managed to suppress their arrogance and teach them some humility, Edward King remarked, looking at Eleanor Bennet with admiration. His gaze carried an increasingly evident affection. Today, I truly had no other choice, Eleanor Bennet replied, suspecting that Edward King had witnessed the entire incident. Lord Bennet is gravely ill. Are you not returning to the manor to check on him today? Edward King asked. My father's illness weighs heavily on my heart as his daughter, but given my current position, I must avoid any suspicion, Eleanor Bennet explained. Then allow this prince to accompany you back to the manor. With imperial physician Zhang having resigned, Lord Bennet's condition cannot be delayed any further. Edward King's ambiguous gaze met Eleanor Bennet's, but her expression was filled only with astonishment. It seemed that peace for the Bennet family would not come easily. I thank your highness, Prince Jing, for your kind offer, Eleanor Bennet said, knowing she could not refuse. She could only bow her head in gratitude. Very well, I shall wait for you at the Radiant Sun Gate during the rooster hour. Edward King departed with a satisfied expression. Eleanor Bennet stood in the courtyard, gazing at the barren branches and fallen leaves scattered around, her heart filled with unease. Edward King's intentions were something she could never accept. She couldn't bear the thought of sharing a man with other women, especially one who was not faithful by nature. Moreover, she still had to deal with Charles King, who loomed over her like a shadow. His icy face seemed capable of taking her life on a whim. Sitting at her desk, Eleanor Bennet wore an expression of despair, sighing repeatedly. Just the thought of Charles King threw her into disarray. That man was destined to be her calamity. Chapter 21, Flowers in the Mirror. Eleanor Bennet arrived at the Radiant Sun Gate at the appointed time and immediately spotted Edward King. He was dressed in a pristine white brocade robe, draped with a jet-black mink cape, standing by the carriage awaiting her. His elegant figure in the wind reminded her of Clara Young's infatuated gaze toward him not long ago. Indeed, he was a man who could easily capture a woman's heart. Unfortunately, he was born into the cold and unfeeling royal family. Today, Eleanor Bennet was not in her official attire but wore a light yellow brocade gown paired with a soft pink silk cloak. Her long black hair, cascading like a waterfall, was neatly tied with a ribbon. Her face, lightly adorned with makeup, exuded an ethereal beauty, resembling a celestial maiden descending to the mortal world. Edward King, upon seeing Eleanor Bennet, was momentarily stunned before smiling. Under the heavens, only she possessed such a pure and transcendent allure, as if untouched by the mortal realm. Your humble subject greets His Highness, Prince Edward. Eleanor Bennet stepped forward and bowed, pretending not to notice Edward King's momentary daze. Eleanor Bennet, there's no need for formalities. Edward King, regaining his composure, stepped forward, intending to hold her hand. Eleanor Bennet, however, stepped back, avoiding his touch. Let us board the carriage. Edward King, realizing his impropriety, moved aside and gestured for Eleanor Bennet to step inside. This time, she did not refuse, offering a slight smile before entering. She settled onto a soft cushion. The interior of the carriage was spacious, featuring a small table made of sandalwood, upon which rested a jade tea set. In the distance, a small brazier heated water for tea, with wisps of steam curling upward. Edward King joined her inside, seating himself beside her. The atmosphere within the carriage grew tense and ambiguous. Eleanor Bennet casually gazed out at the vibrant, lantern-lit streets through the window, ignoring Edward King's lingering gaze upon her. Eleanor Bennet, Edward King leaned against the soft cushion, sipping his tea. Your Highness, do you have any instructions? Seeing that he was no longer staring at her intently, Eleanor Bennet breathed a sigh of relief. How would you feel about being my princess? Edward King looked up at Eleanor Bennet, his eyes filled with an inexplicable fascination. "You must be joking, Your Highness." Eleanor Bennet was startled. Although it wasn't the first time she heard such a bold confession from Edward King, she still blushed. "I'm serious. If you agree, I will request my father's permission for our marriage tomorrow." Edward King grasped Eleanor Bennet's soft hand, this time with a much firmer grip. Eleanor Bennet simply looked at him, not resisting. "Your Highness is kind, but Eleanor Bennet cannot accept." Eleanor Bennet's beautiful eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. "Why?" Edward King couldn't understand why Eleanor Bennet would refuse. There was no grievance in becoming his main consort. Eleanor Bennet desires a loyal, lifelong love with only one person. For someone of the esteemed status of a prince, how could that be possible? Eleanor Bennet decided to make things clear with him, unwilling to prolong the entanglement any further. A lifelong love with only one person? Edward King looked at Eleanor Bennet, his expression incredulous. "I promise to cherish and adore you for a lifetime. I will grant you the most honorable status. Is that still not enough?" Edward King, losing control, held Eleanor Bennet tightly. What must he do to make her understand her irreplaceable position in his heart? Love is something that cannot be shared. Eleanor Bennet and Your Highness may have fate but not destiny. I hope Your Highness finds someone more deserving. Eleanor Bennet pushed Edward King away, her cold demeanor clearly showing her resolve. She did not expect anyone in this era of numerous concubines to understand her concept of love. Yet, she was unaware that in Edward King's heart, she had already become someone he could never let go of. Such a unique woman, if he could not have her, then no one else would. The world would eventually belong to him, and so would she. One day, she would change her mind. The carriage stopped in front of the Bennet residence, and Eleanor Bennet stepped down first. At this moment, Arthur Bennet had already received word and knew Edward King would be arriving with Eleanor Bennet. "Father." Seeing Arthur Bennet waiting outside the residence, Eleanor Bennet hurriedly stepped forward to support him. "Your servant greets His Highness, Prince Edward." Arthur Bennet, noticing Edward King stepping out of the carriage, quickly bowed in respect. "Minister Bennet, you are gravely ill. There is no need for formalities." Edward King observed Arthur Bennet coughing incessantly. Could he truly be unwell? "Your Highness, please come inside for tea." Arthur Bennet invited Edward King inside. Eleanor Bennet helped Arthur Bennet to sit down on the grand chair in the main hall, while Edward King took the seat of honor. "Minister Bennet, your grave illness has greatly concerned my father. Thus, I have come today to visit you personally. I hope you can forgive this sudden intrusion." Edward King's tone was polite, yet it carried an undeniable authority. "Father, may I go check on the medicine?" Eleanor Bennet suspected Edward King's visit was not merely to inquire about her father's health, so she tactfully excused herself. Matters of the court were best left to these seasoned politicians. She truly had no interest in such false pleasantries. Arthur Bennet nodded in approval, catching the lingering gaze of Edward King as he watched Eleanor Bennet leave. Secretly, Arthur Bennet felt delighted. Could it be that Edward King had fallen for his daughter? Eleanor Bennet left the main hall and returned to her room to write a prescription, instructing Clara Young to deliver it to the steward. Arthur Bennet had only been taking a specific concoction she prepared, which induced symptoms resembling a common cold. A simple antidote would cure him. Now that Arthur Bennet's objective had been achieved, he only needed a few days of rest at home before returning to court. Eleanor Bennet exhaled in relief and then went to the Buddhist temple to visit Lady Bennet. It wasn't until after dinner that Eleanor Bennet bid farewell to Lady Bennet and returned to her room. She thought Edward King must have already left by now. "Miss, the master requests your presence in the study," the steward reported from outside the door. "Yes, tell my father I'll come by later." Eleanor Bennet adjusted her jewelry and attire, draped on a cloak, and headed to the study. "Father, you were looking for me?" Eleanor Bennet entered the study and immediately noticed a bowl of still warm medicine placed on the table. "Eleanor, come in. It's cold outside." Arthur Bennet smiled warmly. "Father, the medicine will get cold. Please drink it right away." Eleanor Bennet picked up the bowl and handed it to Arthur Bennet. "Eleanor, you're becoming more and more filial." Arthur Bennet was overjoyed and drank the entire bowl in one go. Eleanor Bennet then offered him tea and assisted him in rinsing his mouth. "Father, after taking this medicine, you should feel better by tomorrow. In a few days, you'll be able to return to court." "Yes, it's thanks to Eleanor's strategy this time that we managed to dispel the suspicions of Prince Jing and Prince Yi." Arthur Bennet stroked his beard, his face brimming with satisfaction. "Although we've escaped this time, such situations are likely to occur more frequently in the future." Eleanor Bennet understood well that maintaining neutrality in the court was no easy feat. A single misstep could make them everyone's target. "That's exactly what worries me." "Eleanor, does Prince Jing have feelings for you?" Arthur Bennet suddenly asked, catching Eleanor Bennet off guard. "Father, why would you ask that? I may have been too forward." Seeing Eleanor Bennet's expression, Arthur Bennet realized he had guessed correctly. "Father, there's nothing between me and His Highness Prince Jing. Please don't make wild assumptions." Eleanor Bennet's serious tone surprised Arthur Bennet. Could it be that Prince Jing's feelings were unrequited and Eleanor had no interest? But that didn't matter. It was enough for Arthur to know that Prince Jing had feelings for her. "Father, I have to enter the palace tomorrow. I'll return to my room now." Eleanor Bennet glanced at Arthur Bennet, whose face showed a hint of smugness, suspecting he was likely plotting something again. The next day, upon returning to the Imperial Medical Institute, Eleanor Bennet found her room filled with blooming plum branches. She was astonished. Who would dare to be so bold as to break off freshly bloomed branches from the Imperial Gardens and bring them here? "Master Bennet, you've returned to the palace." At that moment, Xiao Lingzi from the Imperial Pharmacy happened to pass by and quickly bowed upon seeing Eleanor Bennet. "Xiao Lingzi, who brought these plum branches to my room?" Eleanor Bennet's eyes flashed with anger. To break branches in the Imperial Gardens without permission was truly audacious. "Master Bennet, this morning eunuch Shui from the Palace of Scenic Blossoms sent them over." Xiao Lingzi looked at Eleanor Bennet, who was usually gentle but now visibly furious, and couldn't help but feel a little scared. Don't women generally love flowers? Could Master Bennet be an exception? Palace of Scenic Blossoms? Eleanor Bennet immediately thought this must be an order from Edward King. The servants wouldn't dare to act so boldly. It seemed her cold refusal yesterday was completely misunderstood by Edward King. "Xiao Lingzi, take these flowers to the backyard and burn them." Eleanor Bennet tidied up her medicine chest and headed towards the Hall of Heavenly Purity, leaving Xiao Lingzi bewildered, thinking that the young lady of the Bennet family was indeed a unique case. Today, she wasn't in the mood to pay attention to these flowers. She had to visit the Hall of Morning Flowers to check Charles King's pulse, fearing it would be another difficult encounter. Chapter 22, Hall of Morning Flowers. As Eleanor Bennet entered the Hall of Heavenly Purity, she saw Alexander King writing, with the beautiful concubine Florence beside him grinding ink, a scene of perfect harmony. Eleanor Bennet hurriedly paid her respects. Eleanor Bennet has arrived. Alexander King put down his brush and sat on the couch. Concubine Florence quickly stepped forward to offer tea. His Majesty's health has completely recovered. Eleanor Bennet reported respectfully after checking the pulse. Yes, thanks to Eleanor Bennet's efforts. Alexander King was extremely pleased. Your Majesty, I am relieved to see your health restored, Concubine Florence said coyly, leaning against Alexander King. Eleanor Bennet, you are in charge of caring for Charles. If you need anything, just inform the Imperial Household Department, and I will order them to fully cooperate. From now on, you don't need to come to the Hall of Heavenly Purity for daily checkups. Eleanor Bennet accepted the order and withdrew. Recalling Concubine Florence's demeanor, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel uneasy. Encountering her repeatedly these days was truly unbearable. Eleanor Bennet arrived in front of the Hall of Morning Flowers but saw no one. She was puzzled. Why wasn't there even a single attendant? Given Charles King's level of favor, the place should be bustling with servants. Eleanor Bennet slowly entered the inner hall, hoping to find someone serving there. However, the vast hall was empty. If not for the lavish and clean furnishings, Eleanor Bennet would have thought she had entered a cold palace. Eleanor Bennet carefully observed the Hall of Morning Flowers. The red sandalwood furniture was gilded, the palace lamps intricately carved, and the watercolored silk draped gracefully between tall columns, revealing a large bed. In the center of the hall was a red sandalwood platform, with a rosewood table in front. Beside the table were two copper braziers, emitting a comfortable warmth. On either side of the platform were two sandalwood beds, each with a small rosewood table in front. On the table to the right was a white jade sword stand, holding a precious sword. Eleanor Bennet curiously approached, examining the jewel-encrusted scabbard, with two golden dragons twisting vividly. It was clearly a treasured sword. Observing these luxurious items, each a rare treasure, it was evident that Alexander King doted on his son immensely. Do you know that entering the Hall of Morning Flowers without permission is punishable by death? Eleanor Bennet turned to see Charles King standing at the door, his expression grim. I didn't want to barge in either, but your palace is even lonelier than the cold palace, not a single soul in sight. Eleanor Bennet muttered resentfully. Truly like a ghost, entering without a sound. Charles King sat lazily on the main couch, leaning against soft cushions, covered with a fur blanket. At that moment, a servant brought in tea and quickly retreated. Charles King sipped his tea, seemingly treating Eleanor Bennet as if she didn't exist. The prince seems to be feeling better today. I shall take my leave, Eleanor Bennet said, unwilling to linger around him, preparing to leave. It seems I haven't given you permission to leave yet. Charles King's cold black eyes gleamed with a hint of cunning. What exactly do you want, Your Highness? Eleanor Bennet couldn't fathom his intentions. Come here. Charles King gestured for Eleanor Bennet to approach him. Eleanor Bennet hesitated, wondering what he was planning now. Are you planning to diagnose me from over there? Charles King sneered coldly as he watched her reluctance to come closer. Left with no choice, Eleanor Bennet moved closer, sitting on the bed to check his pulse. His pulse was similar to the last time at the hot springs, yet she still couldn't find any clues. May I ask you a few questions? Eleanor Bennet was entirely clueless about the cold energy emanating from him. If it truly was a cold poison, how had he been afflicted by it? No. Charles King rejected her coldly. Then how am I supposed to diagnose you? Eleanor Bennet suppressed her anger as she replied. Woman, with that attitude of yours toward me, it's enough to warrant execution. Charles King's icy gaze seemed to pierce through her. Anyone can find a reason to punish someone if they wish. Eleanor Bennet stepped back slightly in fear. Breaking into the Hall of Morning Flowers without permission, disregarding my authority, don't you think that's enough? Charles King advanced step by step, trapping Eleanor Bennet in his arms. Charles King! Let me go! Eleanor Bennet struggled to break free, but he held her tightly against his chest. Woman, you're becoming more audacious, daring to call me by my name. Charles King's cold fingers traced along Eleanor Bennet's delicate face, slowly sliding down to her plump cherry lips, evoking an urge to bite. Eleanor Bennet turned her head to avoid his warm breath. I should punish you a little, or you'll forget who your master is. Charles King kissed Eleanor Bennet's lips, causing her eyes to widen in shock. Her breathing grew rapid. Charles King savored the sweetness he had missed for so long, addicted to her taste. Woman, remember to breathe next time. Charles King smirked devilishly as he released the blushing Eleanor Bennet. Charles King, you, Eleanor Bennet stammered in embarrassment, unable to form a coherent sentence. Why did she always end up being taken advantage of by this scoundrel? Charles King, what exactly do you want? If you want my life, just take it. Eleanor Bennet pulled out her hairpin, aiming it directly at her own neck. Charles King was quicker, stopping her before she could act. Without my permission, woman, you have no right to die. Charles King held his injured hand, blood dripping through his fingers. Eleanor Bennet had only wanted to take a gamble, not expecting Charles King to get hurt. He clearly didn't want her life, so what did he want? Haven't you always wanted my life? Why save me? Eleanor Bennet took a clean cloth from the medicine box, carefully bandaging Charles King's wound. I didn't save you. You still have value to me. Eleanor Bennet ignored him, focusing on treating the wound. Shouldn't you tell me where the cold poison in your body came from? Otherwise, I really can't treat it. Today, Eleanor Bennet realized that Charles King was only cold on the outside. This was related to his upbringing. In modern terms, he was just a high school student. Thinking of this, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but smile. As for her, she was practically a spinster. What are you smiling at? Charles King looked at Eleanor Bennet, who seemed secretly pleased, and couldn't help but be curious. She didn't seem afraid of him at all. In this palace, people either respected, hated, or feared him. Only she dared to defy him, dared to challenge his limits. He increasingly found the woman in front of him intriguing, exuding a frankness without any pretense. She even made him lower his guard, marveling at how unique she was. Eleanor Bennet caught a fleeting smile on his usually cold face, surprised as she looked at him. Have you looked enough, woman? Is there a flower on my face? Eleanor Bennet realized her rudeness and quickly looked down. Actually, your smile is more beautiful than a flower. Eleanor Bennet's whispered comment reached Charles King's ears. Can you answer my earlier question? Eleanor Bennet was genuinely curious about him, wanting to know more. I was poisoned with a curse. Charles King maintained his cold demeanor, but when mentioning the curse, a murderous glint appeared in his eyes. A curse? Eleanor Bennet couldn't believe what she heard. As a renowned medical doctor, she felt stumped. This was beyond her imagination. Why are you reacting so strongly? Charles King felt completely baffled. I'm afraid I really can't cure your condition. Eleanor Bennet faced a truly difficult problem this time. I never had any hope of being cured. The hint of sadness in Charles King's eyes tugged at Eleanor Bennet's heart. She had sensed this sorrow from him more than once. There is no knot in this world that cannot be untied. Even if I can't completely cure your illness, I'll do my best to ease your pain. Eleanor Bennet's eyes shone with sincere determination, and her comforting words warmed Charles King's heart. For the first time in years, he felt this warmth, and it came from a stranger. Eleanor Bennet suddenly realized how lonely he was. What good was living in luxury and power? My lord, Dr. Moore requests an audience. At this moment, a servant announced from outside the chamber. Let him in. Charles King resumed his cold, arrogant demeanor, reclining on the bed. Eleanor Bennet did not expect to meet Daniel Moore in the palace again. Surely, he would be even more surprised. Eleanor Bennet looked at the man in white entering the room, a cheerful smile appearing on her face. You don't look too bad, Daniel Moore remarked, glancing at Charles King lying on the bed, not yet noticing Eleanor Bennet's surprise beside him. Were he and Charles King that familiar with each other? There seemed to be no formalities between them. Why, do you need me to be in unbearable pain for you to be happy? Charles King glanced at Eleanor Bennet, who was overly delighted beside him, feeling a bit tense. Could she and Daniel Moore know each other? Eleanor Bennet. Is that you? Daniel Moore suddenly noticed Eleanor Bennet smiling at him, unable to hide his joy. Daniel Moore, long time no see. Eleanor Bennet beamed like a blossoming peach, reminiscent of a spring breeze. Daniel Moore was somewhat excited, not expecting to meet her again. Why are you in the palace? Daniel Moore asked, surprised to find the person he always missed had entered the palace. It's a long story. Eleanor Bennet knew she shouldn't have hidden her identity that day. Do you two know each other? Charles King asked, visibly displeased, seeing Eleanor Bennet and Daniel Moore's familiarity. A sense of jealousy surged within him. Charles, she is the woman with the extraordinary medical skills I told you about. Daniel Moore exclaimed, still cheerful, oblivious to Charles King's darkening mood. Charles King vividly remembered the affection in Daniel Moore's eyes when he spoke of her. He hadn't expected that person to be Eleanor Bennet. Suddenly, he felt as if his treasure had been stolen. Lady Bennet, please leave for now. Come back tomorrow to check my pulse. Charles King ordered, dismissing her. Eleanor Bennet quickly left, noticing his increasingly gloomy face. Before leaving, she playfully winked at Daniel Moore. This smile did not escape Charles King's cold gaze. How is Master doing? Charles King asked with a hint of anger. Daniel Moore immediately sensed his annoyance. But why was he angry? Could it be because of Eleanor Bennet? Master is well, just busy researching the soul silkworm poison. Daniel Moore understood his proud junior too well. The way Charles King looked at Eleanor Bennet carried an inscrutable depth. Could he have developed feelings? Daniel Moore certainly hoped not. With Charles King's personality, Eleanor Bennet would undoubtedly get hurt. He didn't want her to suffer any harm. The two sat in silence, each drinking their own tea. But in their hearts, they both thought of the beautiful woman who had just left. Her smile and gaze were etched deeply in their hearts, like the bright moon, unable to hide its radiant glow. Chapter 23, Conversations Under the Moonlight. Daniel Moore sat in the Hall of Morning Flowers for a while before taking his leave. It had been a long time since he last saw Eleanor Bennet, and he hadn't expected to meet her in the palace. What surprised him even more was that she had become the chief female official of Britain. With many questions and emotions swirling inside him, Daniel Moore headed to the Imperial Medical Institute. Dr. Moore has entered the palace today. A eunuch greeted Daniel Moore warmly upon seeing him. Yes, thank you. May I ask if Lord Bennet is here? Daniel Moore responded politely. Lord Bennet should be in the hall. I have other duties to attend to, please excuse me. The eunuch smiled and withdrew. Daniel Moore entered the hall and saw Eleanor Bennet sitting at a table, seemingly engrossed in some study or research. Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore called softly. Daniel. Come in and sit. Eleanor Bennet's face lit up with joy upon seeing him. Eleanor Bennet, I didn't expect to find you in the palace. Daniel Moore recalled his previous speculations, and the reality brought him a sense of relief. Daniel, I didn't mean to hide it from you, it's just, Eleanor Bennet hesitated. Eleanor Bennet, you don't need to explain, I understand. Daniel Moore knew she must have had her reasons back then. Just seeing her again was enough for him. Daniel, it's been so long since we last met. Why don't you stay in the palace tonight? Eleanor Bennet thought to herself how rare it was to find a true confidant. This was enough for a lifetime. All right. Daniel Moore agreed readily. What he admired most about Eleanor Bennet was her straightforwardness and sincerity. It was what set her apart from other women. You should rest for now. I'll come find you for dinner later. Eleanor Bennet smiled softly and left the hall. Eunuch Lin, Dr. Moore will be staying in the palace tonight. Please prepare a room, Eleanor Bennet instructed Xiao Lindsay, the young eunuch standing outside. Yes, Lord Bennet. Dr. Moore, please follow me, Xiao Lindsay replied respectfully, then led Daniel Moore away. Before leaving, Daniel Moore gave Eleanor Bennet a warm smile. Eleanor Bennet spent her time at the Imperial Pharmacy inspecting the medicinal supplies for the various palaces. It was only when the lanterns were lit that her work was done. The chilly breeze of the night made it the perfect weather for hot pot. She wrote a list, handed Xiao Lindsay a silver ingot, and asked him to make the preparations. Afterward, Eleanor Bennet returned to her room, changed out of her official attire, donned a light blue cloak, and headed to Daniel Moore's quarters. Daniel Moore was waiting for her in his room. When he saw that Eleanor Bennet had changed out of her formal robes, his eyes lit up. Daniel. Eleanor Bennet greeted him with a radiant smile. Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore froze, his face turning a deep shade of red. So men can feel shy too. Eleanor Bennet chuckled softly as she stepped into the room. Daniel, it seems you're quite close. With that cold-faced guy, huh? Eleanor Bennet sipped her tea and asked. Cold-faced? Daniel Moore looked surprised. Charles King. Oh. He's my junior disciple. Daniel Moore thought to himself that the nickname Eleanor Bennet gave Charles King was indeed fitting. Junior disciple? Eleanor Bennet widened her eyes in astonishment. So, the two of you must have some mysterious, highly skilled master, who's also a quirky old man, right? Eleanor Bennet, imagining scenes from martial arts dramas, couldn't help but laugh. Eleanor Bennet, how do you know that? Daniel Moore looked at Eleanor Bennet, who was laughing uncontrollably. She was right, his master's temperament was truly eccentric. I just guessed. Thinking about the things she had experienced, which were even more bizarre than martial arts dramas, Eleanor Bennet sighed deeply. Eleanor Bennet, what's wrong? Daniel Moore noticed her sudden melancholy and felt puzzled. Then you must know about the cold poison in him, right? Mentioning Charles King always brought an overwhelming sadness to Eleanor Bennet. He has the soul silkworm poison from the western reaches snow mountains. Those afflicted with this poison endure a lifetime of icy erosion and unbearable pain. Is there really no way to cure it? Our master has tried countless methods over the years, but none have worked. Daniel Moore sighed helplessly. Hearing this, Eleanor Bennet felt the air grow heavier, her thoughts clouded by doubts about the deaths of concubine Violet and the Empress, which only deepened her unease. Lady Bennet, servant Xiao Lindsay greets you. Eleanor Bennet stepped outside and saw several eunuchs waiting nearby. Xiao Lindsay, just place it on the stone table in the pavilion. Eleanor Bennet glanced at the items she had requested and was pleased. Xiao Lindsay followed her instructions, setting the brass pot with burning charcoal, food, and warm wine on the table. Lady Bennet, everything is ready. Xiao Lindsay seemed curious about what Eleanor Bennet intended to do. Xiao Lindsay, you've worked hard. Take this and have some drinks with the others. Eleanor Bennet handed him a silver ingot as a reward. Thank you, Lady Bennet. Xiao Lindsay happily accepted it and left. Eleanor Bennet eagerly stepped into the pavilion, looking at the spread on the stone table. Everything was perfectly prepared. Daniel, come over and eat. Eleanor Bennet called out to Daniel Moore, who approached with a curious expression. Eleanor Bennet, what is this? Daniel Moore stared at the bubbling broth in the brass pot, along with the raw meat and fresh vegetables, intrigued. Hot pot. Eleanor Bennet finished mixing the dipping sauce and tossed a few slices of meat into the pot. Hot pot. It was Daniel Moore's first time seeing such an unusual way of dining. This weather is perfect for hot pot and some wine. Eleanor Bennet eagerly grabbed a piece of just cooked meat and popped it into her mouth, her face full of satisfaction. Daniel, you must try this, it's delicious. Eleanor Bennet picked up a piece and offered it to Daniel Moore. This moment filled her with happiness. Daniel Moore tasted it and indeed, it was delectable. Help yourself. Eleanor Bennet's cheeks flushed as she smiled radiantly, like the morning sun. The two raised their cups, drinking and chatting cheerfully, completely unaffected by the cold winter night. Daniel Moore found Eleanor Bennet even more captivating tonight. He had seen her gentle and lovable side, her intelligent and sharp demeanor, but her lively and carefree charm this evening mesmerized him further. Her bright smile was etched deeply into his heart, and he knew he wished to be lost in her forever. Eleanor Bennet was especially excited tonight. It was the most relaxing evening she'd had since arriving in this unfamiliar world. After a few more drinks, she began to feel dizzy, her consciousness turning hazy. Daniel Moore gazed at Eleanor Bennet's flushed face, his eyes filled with affection. Eleanor Bennet, you're drunk. Let me help you back. I'm not Eleanor Bennet. My name is Eleanor Bennet. At this point, her consciousness was so blurred, it seemed as though she was returning to her own world. Eleanor Bennet, let me take you back. Daniel Moore was momentarily shaken by her drunken words. Who was Eleanor Bennet? How could she get this drunk? A cold voice interrupted Daniel Moore's thoughts. Charles King stood outside the pavilion, his gaze filled with anger. What are you doing here? Daniel Moore was startled to see Charles King appear at this moment. Knowing you were staying in the palace tonight, I came to check. Charles King stepped forward and scooped up the unconscious Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore stood aside, but he understood clearly, Charles King was here because of her. Recalling the brief fury in the Hall of Morning Flowers, Daniel Moore now realized it was jealousy. Had Charles King fallen for her? "I'll take her back. You should rest early, senior brother." Charles King's cold voice carried a clear reminder to Daniel Moore that the woman in his arms belonged to him. Daniel Moore watched Eleanor Bennet as she slept soundly, his heart tightening, followed by a sense of loss. With Charles King's domineering and icy nature, Eleanor Bennet could never truly be happy by his side. This thought deeply troubled him. Charles King heard that Daniel Moore did not leave the palace today and immediately knew the reason was Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore, who usually disliked the oppressive atmosphere of the palace, would have certainly left if not for her. Thinking of this, a sense of loss rose in his heart as he left the palace in frustration, unintentionally wandering to the Imperial Medical Institute. When he saw Eleanor Bennet and Daniel Moore happily drinking together, his heart was filled with jealousy. He carried Eleanor Bennet back to her room, placed her on the bed, but sat absent-mindedly beside her. Looking at her face, as delicate as a peach blossom, he still convinced himself that he was merely captivated by her uniqueness. How could he possibly fall for a woman? "Eleanor Bennet, don't drink like this again in the future." Charles King gently stroked her flushed cheeks and softly pulled the blanket over her. "Don't call me Eleanor Bennet. I am not Eleanor Bennet. How can I leave this place? I really want to go back." Eleanor Bennet mumbled, her eyes brimming with tears, as if she was deeply heartbroken even in her dreams. Hearing her words, Charles King was startled. "She's not Eleanor Bennet?" He had once doubted it. A noble lady shouldn't possess such profound and peculiar medical skills. Yet, the investigation yielded no flaws. Could there truly be people in this world who look exactly alike? If she wasn't Eleanor Bennet, then her presence in the palace must have a hidden purpose. "Eleanor Bennet, no matter who you are, leaving this place is impossible." Charles King wiped away the tear at the corner of her eye and whispered a few words into her ear before leaving the room with a cold smile. He was certain Eleanor Bennet had her own secret motives. Leaving unscathed? Only if he allowed it. As Charles King stepped outside, he saw Daniel Moore standing in the courtyard, seemingly waiting for him. "Is she all right?" Daniel Moore still seemed uneasy about Eleanor Bennet, who had been drinking. "She's fine. She's asleep now," Charles King replied, surprised that someone as composed as Daniel Moore could also be swayed by this woman. "Eleanor Bennet, senior brother, you'd better stay away from her," Charles King coldly warned. Daniel Moore ignored Charles King and prepared to leave. "Senior brother, don't you find Eleanor Bennet strange? Her medical skills, even you can't discern which school they belong to." Charles King, knowing Daniel Moore wouldn't listen to him, tried to persuade him earnestly. "Perhaps she's not Eleanor Bennet at all." Daniel Moore couldn't explain it either, but recalling her drunken words earlier, it all made sense only if she wasn't Eleanor Bennet. "Senior brother, you should visit the palace less often in the future. Perhaps not meeting her would be the best choice." "How, have you also fallen for her?" He understood Charles King's cold demeanor all too well. Tonight's actions had said it all. "That's a question you shouldn't ask." Charles King swiftly disappeared into the night. Daniel Moore felt the chill in the air, his heart filled with worry. Chapter 24, The Wind of a Troubled Heart. Eleanor Bennet woke up to find herself lying on a warm bed. Her head still ached slightly, and she could only recall being drunk the night before. She faintly remembered dreaming about her deceased parents and perhaps even glimpsing Charles King's cold face. She knew she must have suffered too much because of him to the point where she hated him even in her dreams. Eleanor Bennet got out of bed, washed up, and left her room. Daniel Moore was waiting for her in the main hall. Seeing her still looking weary, he greeted her with a gentle smile. "Daniel." Eleanor Bennet approached him, assuming he must have been the one to bring her back to her room last night. "I've come to bid you farewell. You're leaving the palace." Eleanor Bennet felt a pang of sadness. She deeply admired his freedom. "Yes." Daniel Moore noticed the sorrow in her eyes. "Take care." Eleanor Bennet had initially wanted to keep him at the Imperial Medical Institute, but knowing his free-spirited nature, she doubted he would agree. Otherwise, why would Charles King allow him to leave? Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore hesitated. Eleanor Bennet forced a smile. "If you ever face difficulties, come find me at Harmony Hall." Daniel Moore understood the tangled web of emotions in this situation, a complexity that weighed on his heart. "Daniel, would you be willing to return to the palace to help me?" Eleanor Bennet hesitated for a moment before finally asking. Daniel Moore didn't answer immediately, remaining silent for a while. "I was just asking. This deep palace is like a cage, imprisoning people. Who would willingly step inside?" Eleanor Bennet knew she shouldn't have asked. She gazed at the towering palace walls, their golden tiles and red bricks filling her with a sense of helplessness. Daniel Moore detected the resignation in her tone. Could it be that her entry into the palace had another purpose? "Eleanor Bennet, I'll agree to enter the palace for you, but I must first settle matters at Harmony Hall." Daniel Moore didn't believe Eleanor Bennet had ulterior motives for entering the palace. If she did, it must be because she had her own struggles. However, he knew this decision would inevitably cause friction between him and Charles King. "Really?" Eleanor Bennet grabbed Daniel Moore's sleeve in excitement, her eyes brimming with joy. "Yes." Daniel Moore was resolute. Even if his bond with Charles King weakened, he would stand by her side. He didn't care what her intentions were or who she truly was, his heart belonged solely to her. As Eleanor Bennet watched Daniel Moore's retreating figure, she felt a warm breeze sweep through her heart, bringing her solace. She seemed to sense the emotions in Daniel Moore's eyes, but her feelings for him leaned more toward friendship than romantic love. Couldn't men and women share a deep, platonic friendship like Janice and William? Eleanor Bennet stood on the stone steps, lost in thought. The ginkgo tree in the courtyard had begun shedding its leaves, and a cold breeze swept through, rustling a few withered golden leaves. On the palace walls, flocks of white doves soared gracefully. Their carefree demeanor seemed to mock those trapped within the forbidden palace, oblivious to their own introspection. "What are you thinking about?" Charles King had been watching Eleanor Bennet's gaze for quite some time and finally couldn't hold back his words. Eleanor Bennet turned around and saw him. It was him. An ominous feeling suddenly rose in her heart. "Your servant greets His Highness, the Duke of E." Eleanor Bennet bowed respectfully. "Have you only now learned the proper etiquette of a subject?" Charles King sneered coldly. Eleanor Bennet knew he was referring to her cold demeanor toward him at the Hall of Morning Flowers the other day. A trace of resentment surged within her. "What brings your highness here? Is there something you wish to command?" Eleanor Bennet lowered her head, avoiding a direct response. "You're coming with me." Charles King grabbed Eleanor Bennet's hand and pulled her along. "Your Highness, I still have many tasks to attend to." Eleanor Bennet, unsure of his intentions, felt a twinge of panic. My matters are more important. Charles King dragged Eleanor Bennet out of the Imperial Medical Institute. His pace was swift, and Eleanor Bennet struggled to keep up, practically being pulled along. Palace servants they passed stopped and bowed their heads, not daring to gossip. In their hearts, they all thought the same thing: Dr. Bennet must have offended the Duke of E, a man as fearsome as the god of death. Seeing the sympathetic glances from the onlookers, Eleanor Bennet sighed inwardly. If Charles King decided to punish her today, no one would dare to intervene. The two exited through the radiant sun gate, where a spacious carriage awaited. Charles King climbed into the carriage without sparing a glance at the breathless Eleanor Bennet. Inside, he sat coldly, his gaze fixed on her hesitation. Still not getting in? Are you waiting for me to invite you? Charles King said as he toyed with the command token in his hand. It seems His Highness has fully recovered. You look well today, and your steps are steady. Eleanor Bennet sneered, casting a glance at Blood Shadow standing nearby. Today, she had a clear view of his face, sharp brows and bright eyes, yet exuding a cold aura. Truly, like master, like servant. You there. Help me. Eleanor Bennet commanded Blood Shadow. Blood Shadow hesitated, glancing at Charles King's expression, unsure whether to act. You truly are just a servant. Eleanor Bennet glared before stepping into the carriage herself. She chose the seat farthest from Charles King. At that moment, Charles King had his eyes closed, resting, allowing Eleanor Bennet a brief moment of peace. Gazing at the bustling scenery outside the window, she realized it had been a long time since she last returned to the Bennet residence. The carriage stopped in front of an official residence, and Charles King stepped out. Eleanor Bennet followed, intending to jump down, but to her surprise, Charles King lifted her down directly. Just then, another carriage pulled up at the entrance, and Edward King happened to witness the scene. A pang of tightness struck Edward King's chest as he wondered since when they had become so intimate. Eleanor Bennet, spotting Edward King from afar, couldn't help but feel puzzled. Why was he here too? What was this situation? What game was Charles King playing now? Eleanor Bennet raised her head to look at the plaque on the official residence. The three golden characters, Department of Internal Affairs, gleamed with authority. Ah, ninth brother is here too. I thought you'd be resting in the palace, Edward King remarked, his gaze fixed on Eleanor Bennet behind Charles King, unable to hide his jealousy. The Emperor has issued an imperial decree, how could I dare defy it? Charles King emphasized the words, imperial decree, but Edward King's expression remained composed. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but admire how, despite the tense atmosphere, they still managed to perform their act of brotherly affection. Your subject greets His Highness Prince Charles and His Highness Prince Edward, Eleanor Bennet said, not wanting to get caught up in their silent battle but realizing escape was unlikely. Dr. Bennet, it's been a while, Edward King said coldly, his gaze sharp as if doubting her true intentions. Third brother, ninth brother, let's go in. James King interrupted at the right moment, easing the taut atmosphere. Eleanor Bennet followed Charles King into a large prison. The walls, made of smooth, damp green bricks, exuded darkness, with only a small skylight on the roof letting in light. She looked at the man in the cell, his hair disheveled, his demeanor wild like a madman, and instinctively stepped back in fear. At that moment, a warm arm appeared behind her. Turning around, Eleanor Bennet met Edward King's smile. Don't be afraid, that's our eldest brother, Edward King whispered softly in her ear. Eleanor Bennet looked at the figure before her, not quite human yet not entirely beast-like, insane and foolish. So, this was David King. Dr. Bennet, please examine our eldest brother and see if his condition can be treated, Charles King said, coughing lightly as he stared intently at David King in the cell. Eleanor Bennet immediately understood that the request for treatment was merely an excuse. The true purpose was to determine whether David King's madness was real or feigned. What were Charles King and Edward King trying to achieve? Could it be that they both sought to bring down the Duke of Stirling? The Duke of Stirling had accompanied the Empress Dowager to pray for blessings and had yet to return to the capital. At this moment, it indeed seemed like the perfect opportunity to overthrow the Duke of Stirling. Eleanor Bennet, I will accompany you. Edward King thought Eleanor Bennet was afraid, so he stood beside her and spoke gently. Thank you, King Edward. Eleanor Bennet did not refuse, only gave Charles King a cold, expressionless glance. What, in his heart, was truly important? Power? The kingdom? Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but smirk coldly. It certainly wasn't affection. If Edward King had any feelings, then Charles King likely had none. Eleanor Bennet entered the cell and saw David King charging towards her like a madman, mumbling incessantly. Edward King quickly pulled Eleanor Bennet aside as several guards restrained the frenzied David King. Eleanor Bennet stepped forward, looked into David King's eyes, and checked his pulse. After a while, she still couldn't determine the cause of David King's madness. Eleanor Bennet, how is the Crown Prince? Edward King asked as he stepped forward. The Crown Prince has indeed gone mad. Eleanor Bennet continued to stare at David King, believing that no matter how well one acted, the eyes couldn't lie. Eleanor Bennet noticed a slight change in David King's eyes. Can he be cured? Charles King asked indifferently from outside. I will do my utmost. Eleanor Bennet resolved to dive into these murky waters. If there was indeed something on David King that they wanted, perhaps it would become a card for her to leave the palace in the future. Eleanor Bennet glanced at David King with an emotionless face, suspecting he was feigning madness. It was undoubtedly a good way to preserve his life. She believed that Charles King and Edward King had also considered this possibility, otherwise, they wouldn't have let her intervene. Helping David King today might make it easier to approach him in the future. Eleanor Bennet followed them out of the prison and left the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Eleanor Bennet, I will escort you back to the palace. Edward King stepped forward to offer, not wanting her to return with Charles King. Third brother, I haven't had Dr. Bennet check my pulse today, so there's no need to trouble you with my return to the palace. Charles King, without any courtesy, pulled Eleanor Bennet into the carriage. Third brother, the ninth fox has the Emperor's decree, and Eleanor Bennet is now his chief physician. We are powerless. Edward King understood the frustration in his heart. He always felt that Eleanor Bennet was not a simple person. If she affected their grand plans, she would have to be eliminated in the future. Chapter 25, Azure Water Hot Springs. Eleanor Bennet noticed the direction the carriage was heading. It didn't seem like the road back to the palace. She couldn't help but mutter to herself, what is he up to this time? This isn't the road back to the palace. Eleanor Bennet cautiously spoke up. I never said I was returning to the palace. Charles King replied, still focused on the document in his hand. Stop the carriage, I want to go back to the palace. Eleanor Bennet could no longer hold back. Is David King truly mad? Charles King looked up at Eleanor Bennet, who appeared slightly angry, his eyes cold as if seeing through her thoughts. A prince pampered from birth, now reduced to a prisoner, how could he not go mad? Eleanor Bennet thought of David King's current situation and couldn't help but lament the unpredictability of life. "Woman, you'd better hide your little schemes. I am not Edward King and won't be fooled by your frail appearance." Charles King suddenly pulled Eleanor Bennet, who was sitting beside him, into his embrace. "Charles King, you..." Eleanor Bennet blushed immediately, and before she could finish her sentence, her lips were covered by a cold sensation. She bit down hard, and the taste of blood spread in her mouth. "Woman, you are truly bold." Charles King released Eleanor Bennet, his eyes flashing with a hint of murderous intent. "Charles King, since you know I'm not weak, you should behave yourself in the future." Eleanor Bennet glared at him, warning him. "Woman, how about we make a deal?" Charles King suddenly changed the subject as if the previous incident had never happened. "I never make deals with devils." Eleanor Bennet sneered, wanting to live a few more years. "Don't you want to leave the palace?" Eleanor Bennet was shocked by Charles King's mysterious expression. "How did he know?" "You help me get the records from David King, and I'll let you escape." Charles King confidently revealed Eleanor Bennet's thoughts, looking smug. "If you can't get them, why assume I can?" Truthfully, even Eleanor Bennet wasn't sure. "Because you saved David King's life today." Charles King never believed David King was truly mad. It was merely a delaying tactic on his part. Eleanor Bennet looked at the man before her, he was truly cunning. Did she have any other choice? "All right, I agree to this deal." Eleanor Bennet understood what this meant. The thing in David King's possession was desired not only by Charles King. The Duke of Stirling and Edward King were also after it. By doing this, she was gambling with her life. The carriage had stopped, and Blood Shadow respectfully waited for his master to alight. Eleanor Bennet looked out the window, it was the same bamboo forest as before. She couldn't help but wonder why Charles King had brought her here. "Blood Shadow, if anyone dares approach tonight, kill them without mercy," Charles King ordered coldly before entering the bamboo house. Eleanor Bennet hesitated outside. Was his cold ailment acting up again tonight? Or did the soul silkworm poison have a fixed time to act? Eleanor Bennet slowly stepped into the bamboo house, standing behind a screen, watching the steam rise from the hot water, feeling momentarily awkward. Charles King removed his outer robe, dressed only in innerwear, and stepped into the warm pool, closing his eyes to rest. Eleanor Bennet withdrew, sitting on a green stone outside, watching the sunset fade. The crescent moon began to appear. She watched the bamboo forest gradually sink into darkness, silent as a land of death. "Master Bennet." Blood Shadow looked at Eleanor Bennet, who appeared melancholic, and couldn't help stepping forward to inquire. Eleanor Bennet paid him no attention, her gaze merely swept over the flickering lamp in the room. "Tonight is the new moon, the day when the prince's cold poison flares up." Blood Shadow gazed at the silent night sky, his mood visibly downcast. "Blood Shadow, how long have you been following him?" Eleanor Bennet looked at Blood Shadow with concern, sensing his worry. 10 years. Blood Shadow replied. "Then haven't you been by his side since he was just a child?" Eleanor Bennet was astonished, he seemed to be only in his 20s. "Since 10 years ago, on every new moon, the prince has endured the agony of cold energy corroding his bones. Back then, he was just a child." Without the protective martial arts taught by the old master of the Celestial Mountains, he might have perished long ago. Eleanor Bennet hadn't expected Charles King to have suffered for 10 years. She had once witnessed the torment he endured when the poison acted up, an excruciating pain beyond words. It was no wonder his personality had become so dark and twisted. The joys that should belong to a child were replaced by suffering in his world, shaping him into who he was today. Was it really his fault? Eleanor Bennet's compassion surged again. Perhaps this was why she always felt a pang of sorrow whenever she saw him. Master Bennet, you are the only one who can end the prince's suffering. I beg you, please save him. Blood Shadow suddenly knelt before Eleanor Bennet, pleading earnestly. Stand up. I will do my best. Charles King, as cold-hearted as he was, still had such loyal subordinates, truly rare. Even the cruelest people had some trace of goodness in their fate. Eleanor Bennet stepped into the bamboo house, moving past the screen. By now, much of the mist over the lake had cleared, and Charles King was still in the water. Seeing that he seemed fine, she sat down on the bed behind him to rest. Looking at his back, she couldn't help but sigh. Woman, come here. Charles King opened his eyes upon hearing her sigh. Eleanor Bennet hesitated slightly, then stepped cautiously toward the lake, standing warily behind him. She didn't want a repeat of last time, where she ended up tumbling into the water like a chicken. As she approached, she noticed his face was covered in water droplets, and his breathing was labored. Are you feeling unwell? Eleanor Bennet sensed a hint of unease. Charles King didn't answer her and kept his eyes closed. Suddenly, blood spurted from his mouth, and his entire body began sinking. Charles King. Eleanor Bennet realized the situation was critical. She quickly knelt by the lake and supported him. His body was icy cold, sending a shiver down her spine. She struggled to pull him ashore and hurriedly checked his pulse. The cold energy in his body was circulating rapidly, accompanied by chaotic internal energy. She hadn't detected this turbulent energy last time. Without further thought, Eleanor Bennet swiftly took out her acupuncture needles and began administering treatment to alleviate his pain. However, this time was not as smooth as before. Charles King's entire body convulsed, and his consciousness gradually faded. Charles King, you must hold on. Eleanor Bennet withdrew the needle, unable to hide her panic. How had he endured all these 10 years? Cold. So cold. Charles King mumbled softly, his body curling up. Eleanor Bennet glanced at the warm spring water before her, disregarding the propriety of men and women maintaining distance. She removed her outer cloak, embraced Charles King, and stepped into the pool with him. Charles King seemed to sense the warmth from Eleanor Bennet's body and clung to her tightly, as if trying to merge her into himself. Looking at the face that still captivated hearts, Eleanor Bennet noticed that the arrogance and coldness of the past had completely vanished. Her heart ached involuntarily, and the resentment she once held for him seemed to have dissolved long ago. What was the point of possessing the whole world if it couldn't dispel this bone-deep pain? Even boundless glory could not soothe this profound sorrow. For a moment, Eleanor Bennet found Charles King pitiful. Could his heart ever be filled with light? Her emotions became tangled, her thoughts swirling endlessly. She had no idea how much time had passed when Eleanor Bennet felt Charles King's body gradually relax. She checked his pulse, sensing the cold energy slowly dissipating. Looking up, she saw the first rays of dawn breaking through the sky. Eleanor Bennet helped Charles King out of the water, dried him off, and placed him on the bed. Then, she stepped behind the curtain to remove her soaked clothes. Wrapping herself in an outer robe, she approached the wardrobe by the bed to search for something. In the bottom compartment, she found a light blue undergarment and a simple, elegant dress. Recalling the last time she returned home drenched, she figured he must have deliberately left these for her. It turned out Charles King wasn't entirely heartless. In the upper compartment of the wardrobe, there were several men's outfits. Judging by the fine snow silk fabric, Eleanor Bennet knew they belonged to the man lying on the bed. However, she was unaware that Charles King had already woken up and was leaning against the bed, watching her with a dreamy gaze. "What are you thinking about, young lady?" Charles King spoke, knowing she had saved him again. Last night, he had intended to use his internal energy to counter the cold, but he had nearly lost control. "Huh? You're awake." Eleanor Bennet clutched her collar tightly, unaware that her delicate appearance had already caught Charles King's eye. She picked up the clean clothes that had fallen to the ground, pondering how to change into them. Charles King, noticing her flushed cheeks, couldn't help but feel drawn to her. "Come here, young lady." A rare gentleness flickered in Charles King's eyes, leaving Eleanor Bennet stunned, wondering if she was imagining things. She stepped back, intending to circle around the pool to avoid him. Sensing her intention, Charles King stood up and pulled Eleanor Bennet onto the bed. She wanted to resist, but remembering her lack of clothing underneath, she dared not move recklessly. She could only clutch her outer robe tightly. "Finally, you're being obedient, woman," Charles King murmured, planting a soft kiss on Eleanor Bennet's earlobe. His warm breath flustered her, making her entire body flush with heat. "Charles King, I should have killed you last night." Eleanor Bennet blamed herself for being too soft-hearted. Charles King ignored her words and leaned down to capture her cherry lips. He was addicted to her taste, the immersive feeling making him unable to control himself. The intense possessiveness within him overflowed, even her smile could only belong to him. Under his increasingly deep kiss, Eleanor Bennet found herself unable to resist, even harboring a vague sense of anticipation. Eleanor Bennet's outer garment had slipped halfway down, revealing her smooth, porcelain-like shoulders. The beauty of her chest became subtly apparent. Charles King's kiss gradually trailed down, pausing in the soft area between. Eleanor Bennet painfully snapped back to reality, realizing they were now completely exposed. She, embarrassed, pushed Charles King away, pulling her garment back up, and slapped him. "Charles King, you're shameless." Eleanor Bennet cried and scolded him, appearing as fragile as a flower in the rain. She was born in modern times and wasn't particularly conservative in her thinking. But matters of affection had to be with someone she loved, and she and Charles King were absolutely impossible. "Is it so unpleasant to be my woman?" Charles King didn't understand. Clearly, she had enjoyed his affection just moments ago, yet now she acted like this. Women, always saying one thing and thinking another. "I've told you, I don't want this. If it happens again, I won't hold back." Eleanor Bennet wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes and hid behind the curtain to dress. Charles King sat cross-legged on the bed, beginning to adjust his internal energy. Eleanor Bennet tidied her clothes and stepped out of the bamboo house. Blood Shadow seemed to be waiting for her outside. "Lady Bennet, His Highness ordered me to escort you back to the palace." Blood Shadow bowed in salute. "Take me back to the Bennet residence." Eleanor Bennet, feeling very troubled, wanted to find a quiet place to calm down. Eleanor Bennet glanced out the carriage window towards the bamboo house. Thinking about the embarrassing scene with Charles King, her heart involuntarily beat faster. She had clearly responded to him earlier. Could she actually have feelings for him? Eleanor Bennet, you must be sleep-deprived and stressed. Even if there were no men left in the world, you couldn't possibly like him. Eleanor Bennet kept reminding herself, weakly holding her head, full of frustration. Chapter 26. The underlying current. Eleanor Bennet returned to the Bennet residence, leaving everyone in the household utterly astonished. Why would the young lady come back at this time? Moreover, she hadn't informed the residents beforehand. Housekeeper, where is my mother? Eleanor Bennet walked straight into the estate, her mind too preoccupied to think about anything else. The madam is at the Buddhist temple, reciting scriptures. The master has gone to court and has not yet returned. The housekeeper looked at Eleanor Bennet's weary face, his heart filled with doubt. I'll go to my room first. Don't disturb my mother. I will visit her later, Eleanor Bennet instructed before quickly heading to her chamber. Young lady, you've returned. Clara Young, upon seeing Eleanor Bennet, joyfully ran forward to greet her. Clara Young, how have you been lately? Eleanor Bennet asked with a faint smile. I've been well. How about you, young lady? Clara Young asked with concern, but Eleanor Bennet didn't reply. Clara Young, I want to take a bath. Eleanor Bennet leaned tiredly on her bed, closing her eyes. Clara Young complied and left, her heart filled with suspicion. What was wrong with the young lady today? She seemed troubled. Could something have happened in the palace? Young lady, the water is ready. Let me assist you in changing clothes. Clara Young returned after preparing everything, stepping forward to serve, but Eleanor Bennet declined. Clara Young, I'm a bit hungry. Go prepare breakfast. Also, tell the housekeeper to send someone to the palace and inform them I'm unwell. Clara Young grew even more suspicious but dared not ask further. She obeyed and left. Eleanor Bennet removed her garments and immersed herself in the warm, fragrant water. Her thoughts wandered to the ledger Charles King had mentioned. What exactly was recorded in it? Was it the reason David King feigned madness? David King being imprisoned, could it also be related to this? The intricacies of the palace were far more complex than she had imagined. Eleanor Bennet stood up and put on clean clothes. Suddenly, she noticed a few bruises on her chest, and memories of the hot spring incident resurfaced. A man like him, cold and unfeeling, viewed women as nothing more than playthings. For now, all she could do was hope that Charles King would keep his promise and one day release her from the palace. Thinking about leaving the palace, though she yearned for it, a faint sadness welled up inside her. Could she truly leave this place unscathed? After visiting Madame Bennet at the Buddhist temple, Eleanor Bennet returned to her chamber to rest. She had stayed up all night and now just wanted to sleep. Arthur Bennet returned home from court and, upon hearing the housekeeper report that Eleanor Bennet had called in sick, couldn't help but feel worried. Currently, Eleanor Bennet was serving in the Hall of Morning Flowers, and the king was far from a benevolent person. Could it be that Eleanor Bennet had encountered trouble and deliberately fled back? Thinking this, Arthur Bennet got off his sedan chair, his heart burning with anxiety, and headed straight to the study. Steward, please invite the young lady to the study. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Arthur Bennet decided to call Eleanor Bennet to clarify matters. Master, the young lady has instructed that she needs to rest and does not wish to be disturbed. She mentioned that she will come to greet you herself once she feels better. The steward thought of Eleanor Bennet now, her beauty captivating, a stark contrast to the little blonde girl from years ago. Now, he felt a bit apprehensive about this young lady. Hearing the steward's words, Arthur Bennet felt somewhat reassured. Perhaps Eleanor truly was just unwell and had returned home to recuperate. Eleanor Bennet woke up in the late afternoon. After finishing her dinner, she hurried to pay her respects to Arthur Bennet. She had no intention of telling him about David King, merely brushing over a few details before excusing herself. Returning to her chamber, Eleanor flipped through several medical books, searching for records about ancient poisons. This was an entirely unfamiliar field to her. Yet, suddenly, she felt a strong desire to cure Charles King, perhaps driven only by compassion for him. The Hall of Morning Flowers remained silent and cold. Blood Shadow leaned against the bed, half closing his eyes by the flickering light of the fire. "Is everything arranged?" Charles King asked, his voice cold, his face hidden in the shadows. "Everything is in order," Blood Shadow replied. "As long as Eleanor Bennet retrieves the records, Brian King will be eliminated." The sound of a cup shattering interrupted Blood Shadow's words. "My lord, what about Eleanor Bennet? How should we handle her?" Blood Shadow couldn't help but feel uneasy when mentioning Eleanor Bennet. "Her life is still useful. Assign someone to protect her. Starting tomorrow, many will want to take her life." Charles King sneered. Eleanor Bennet was right, one should never make deals with the devil, and he was indeed a devil. Unfortunately, despite knowing this, she still chose to proceed. In that case, she had only herself to blame. Blood Shadow understood the meaning behind Charles King's words. He had once thought Eleanor Bennet might be an exception, but now it seemed she was just another pawn. Once a pawn becomes expendable, its fate is sealed. Blood Shadow couldn't help but feel pity for Eleanor Bennet. Eleanor Bennet soon received an imperial decree summoning her to the palace to treat Brian King. Charles King was clearly eager to uncover the whereabouts of that item. Eleanor hurried to the palace, heading straight for the Hall of Morning Flowers. When it came to Charles King, she could not afford to let her guard down. Having chosen to deal with the devil, she had to be fully prepared for anything. "Recovering so quickly, are we?" Charles King remarked as Eleanor Bennet hurried in, his tone provocative. "Thanks to your concern, Your Highness." Eleanor did not bow, simply taking a seat on a nearby chair. "I have received the imperial decree to treat the crown prince," Eleanor said, cutting herself off and quietly sipping tea. "What are you trying to say?" Charles King knew her words carried hidden meaning. "If Your Highness and I have an agreement, I hope you will honor my conditions. Otherwise, I truly don't know how I can assist you." Eleanor observed Charles King's eyes grow colder, guessing that no one had ever dared set conditions for him before. "Let's hear it." Charles King suppressed his anger, curious to see what this woman was plotting. "The Crown Prince is currently in the dungeon, an unsuitable place for recovery. I humbly request Your Highness petition the Emperor to have him transferred to the Imperial Medical Institute under house arrest. That would make my work easier." Eleanor knew the dungeon was filled with spies, she feared she might be silenced before even obtaining the records. Charles King pondered the implications of Eleanor's words. He had underestimated this woman. Placing David King under house arrest at the Imperial Medical Institute would remove him from Charles's surveillance, as well as from the eyes of others. Could it be that Eleanor had already guessed he wouldn't keep his promise? The prince doesn't need to rush to answer me, I have all the time to wait. Eleanor Bennet bowed and took her leave, stepping out of the hall. Eleanor Bennet, don't play tricks in front of me. Otherwise, I'll destroy the entire Bennet family in the blink of an eye. Charles King coldly agreed to Eleanor Bennet's request while issuing a stern warning. I do not doubt your highness's capabilities. I only hope your highness keeps his promise. Eleanor Bennet smiled lightly, her expression as delicate as misty rain, before swiftly departing from the Hall of Morning Flowers. Upon returning to the Imperial Medical Institute, she found Daniel Moore sipping tea in the hall. Seeing Eleanor Bennet enter, Daniel Moore gave her a subtle smile. Daniel, you're here. Eleanor Bennet's previously somber expression immediately brightened. Eleanor Bennet, I heard you were unwell. Daniel Moore looked at her, realizing his concerns had been excessive. Just a cold. I've already recovered. Eleanor Bennet invited him to sit, her tone soft. Eleanor Bennet, I've taken care of the matter at Harmony Hall. Daniel Moore had decided to assist her in entering the palace. Daniel, thank you. Eleanor Bennet understood well that the Emperor highly valued Daniel Moore. If he wished to enter the palace, everything would naturally go smoothly. Eleanor Bennet, there's no need for thanks between us in the future. Daniel Moore's timely assistance moved Eleanor deeply. In this palace filled with treachery, he was the only person she could trust. Daniel, do you know about Charles losing his mind? Eleanor Bennet felt it necessary to discuss her treatment plans with him. Yes, I've heard a little about it, Daniel Moore replied, a sudden sense of foreboding rising within him. The Emperor has issued an edict, ordering me to treat him. Eleanor Bennet, there's definitely a conspiracy here. You must be extremely cautious. Daniel, there truly is a conspiracy. And David King is only pretending to be insane. You know this, but how? Daniel Moore's face was filled with doubt and concern. Because Charles King wants the ledger that David King has. Eleanor Bennet said helplessly. Is it because of him? Daniel Moore clearly misunderstood the meaning behind Eleanor Bennet's words. Daniel, I have no other choice. I want to leave this place of turmoil. Eleanor Bennet knew he was overthinking, but she didn't want to explain further. Eleanor Bennet, I understand your struggles. Daniel Moore's trust provided Eleanor Bennet with great comfort. If she could successfully escape this chaotic place, she genuinely wished to roam the world with Daniel Moore. Eleanor Bennet soon received an imperial edict to place David King under house arrest at the Imperial Medical Institute, along with Alexander King's approval. Daniel Moore was smoothly appointed to work at the Imperial Medical Institute. Alexander King arranged for David King to stay in a quiet, secluded courtyard in the northern part of the institute. The area was guarded by palace guards, and no one except Eleanor Bennet was allowed to enter. Eleanor Bennet, without a doubt, became the only person who could interact with David King. Eleanor Bennet understood clearly that a struggle was gradually unfolding, and this time, she was at its very center. The success or failure of this battle revolved around that crucial ledger. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but wonder what exactly was recorded in it. Why were Charles King and Edward King so obsessed with it? What was their ultimate goal? If it targeted the So family, then she herself was already in grave danger. She couldn't rule out the possibility that the Duke of Stirling might become desperate and resort to silencing her permanently. And the Emperor, who was watching the tigers fight from the sidelines, what was he waiting for? Eleanor Bennet didn't believe for a second that Alexander King was unaware of the motives behind all this. She deeply sensed that this was an intricate power struggle between multiple factions, and the greatest victor might not have revealed themselves yet. Chapter 27, Unveiling Clues. Eleanor Bennet decided to meet David King, the man feigning madness. She still vividly remembered the seemingly casual remark he made at the Chrysanthemum Festival, a phrase etched deeply in her memory. Perhaps those within the palace excelled most at disguise, and David King was no exception. However, his greed had led him to his current downfall. Eleanor Bennet walked in slowly, signaling the guards to retreat. She stared coldly at the man before her, his hair disheveled, his body covered in dirt, a far cry from the graceful figure he had been at the festival. "Your Highness, I pay my respects," Eleanor said, observing David King's act of foolishness, her eyes briefly revealing a flicker of astonishment, further solidifying her suspicions. "Your ability to feign madness is truly remarkable, Your Highness," Eleanor stated bluntly as she took a seat, exposing his act without hesitation. David King maintained his vacant, dazed demeanor, showing no reaction. "It seems Your Highness is beyond saving. Perhaps I should report to His Majesty and suggest sending you to the dungeon," Eleanor remarked as she stood, preparing to leave. "Eleanor Bennet, what is it that you truly want?" David King finally spoke, realizing he could no longer keep up the charade. "To save you," Eleanor replied coldly. "I do not wish to be saved by one of the 9 foxes," David King retorted with a sneer. Eleanor was taken aback. Despite his captivity, he seemed well informed about the outside world. She realized she had underestimated him. "The king's faction won't save you, but I am not one of his people," she replied. "What do you mean, Eleanor Bennet?" David King asked, suspicion evident in his expression. "Your Highness, you must understand your situation. Even if you continue to fake madness, how long can you delay the inevitable? Aren't you afraid that the hidden forces behind this will silence you permanently?" "Haha, Eleanor Bennet, I must admit I admire your courage and intelligence. But you underestimate me," David King laughed loudly. "If Your Highness is unafraid, it must mean you have a safeguard. But in this world, only the dead can keep secrets." "Surely, Your Highness understands this," Eleanor said, watching as his expression shifted from amusement to concern. He wasn't entirely unshaken. "You'll never get what you want from me, Eleanor Bennet." "Stop wasting your breath," David King declared. "Feigning madness is merely a means for Your Highness to protect yourself. Why not strike a deal with me instead?" she proposed. "And why should I trust you?" David King sneered, dismissing her as a naive girl. "I can help you disappear without a trace, freeing you from these schemes to live the rest of your life in peace. You may not trust me, but I believe Your Highness has no other way out." "Consider my offer," Eleanor said as she prepared to leave. She never expected David King to be easily swayed, so she wasn't in a hurry. "What do you want?" David King seemed somewhat intrigued. "The ledger in your hands," Eleanor Bennet said and then left, leaving David King deep in thought. Eleanor Bennet had noticed his hesitation, betting on the survival instincts of human nature. She was certain that no matter which side obtained the ledger, the first person to be killed would undoubtedly be David King. Thus, the ledger had become his talisman, and he would never hand it over easily. Eleanor Bennet herself was not entirely confident in this transaction. After all, convincing David King to trust her was indeed a difficult task. Even after obtaining the ledger, would Charles King truly keep his promise? Even if he did, just knowing the secrets of the ledger alone would make it hard for her to avoid being hunted down. Leaving the palace would mean a life on the run, and she truly needed to carefully assess the feasibility of this plan. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel she had been too hasty and overly simplistic in her thinking. Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore noticed her silence and heavy thoughts, and he grew concerned for her. Daniel, I'm fine. Eleanor Bennet gazed out at the gloomy sky through the window, listening to the howling northern wind. It was already winter. She sighed. It had been half a year since she arrived in this other world. Daniel Moore looked at Eleanor Bennet, who seemed burdened as she stood by the window. What he feared might truly be inevitable. Servant greets Lady Bennet and Mr. Moore. At that moment, a eunuch entered and bowed before Eleanor Bennet and Daniel Moore. No need for such formalities. Eleanor Bennet assessed the visitor, finding him somewhat familiar. Lady Bennet, this servant comes under the orders of His Highness King Edward to summon you to the palace to treat an illness. Eleanor Bennet recalled, this was Steward Shuey, the head eunuch of the Palace of Scenic Blossoms. What happened to His Highness? Eleanor Bennet asked curiously. Last night, His Highness drank with the 4th and 5th princes. Perhaps due to the joy of the occasion, he drank a bit too much. This morning, he woke feeling unwell. Thus, he specifically sent this servant to trouble Lady Bennet. Steward Shuey replied with a calm and humble demeanor. In that case, please wait a moment. I'll fetch my medical kit and accompany you immediately. Eleanor Bennet responded with a smile and then went inside to retrieve her kit. Eleanor Bennet, be careful. Daniel Moore cautioned her, worried. How timely this illness of King Edward's was. Just yesterday, David King had placed the Imperial Medical Institute under house arrest, and today, Edward fell ill. Don't worry. I can handle it. Eleanor Bennet reassured him with a smile before leaving the Imperial Medical Institute. Eleanor Bennet waited in the main hall of the Palace of Scenic Blossoms, awaiting King Edward's summons. In this cold weather, the outside world was barren, with only withered branches in sight. Yet, the Palace of Scenic Blossoms was lush and green. Inside the hall, several pots of vibrant greenery thrived, exuding vitality everywhere. From the arrangement of the scenery, it was easy to discern the temperament of its owner. The personality of Edward King was worlds apart from that of David King, completely opposite. Edward's gentle and elegant demeanor seemed to win people over more easily. However, beneath that refined and gentle exterior lay the innate coldness of a monarch. Master Bennet, you've waited long. His Highness invites you in. Eunuch Tweed stepped out to deliver the message. Eleanor Bennet walked lightly into the inner chamber, passing a finely carved rosewood screen, and immediately noticed a bed made of manhwa wood. The intricate carvings revealed it to be a top-tier piece. Edward King lay reclining on the bed, beside him a woman with cloud-like hair styled high, her beauty as radiant as jade. Judging by her attire and jewelry, she was likely a concubine. Among the royal family, harems were customary. Edward King was no exception, except for David King, who was currently poisoned. Fortunately for him, the poison rendered him harmless, otherwise, with his looks that even women envied, he might have captivated countless young hearts. Eleanor Bennet pays her respects to His Highness King Edward. Eleanor Bennet, realizing her breach of etiquette, quickly bowed in salute. Dr. Bennet, rise. Take a seat. Edward King did not look at Eleanor Bennet but instead smiled at the beauty beside him. Remaining composed, Eleanor Bennet seated herself to the side and began checking his pulse. Dr. Bennet, is His Highness's condition serious? The beauty spoke, though her eyes betrayed jealousy. Your Grace, His Highness merely has a mild cold and needs only rest to recover, Eleanor Bennet replied as she stood. She had already guessed that today's summons for a pulse check was merely a trap set by Edward King. Yet she still couldn't discern his purpose. Was it simply to flaunt his affection with a concubine? Millie Cyrus, leave us. Edward King's gaze suddenly darkened. Consort Cyrus, slightly frightened, bowed and retreated from the chamber. In the now spacious hall, only Eleanor Bennet and Edward King remained. The sweet fragrance lingering in the air heightened Eleanor Bennet's unease. Why are you helping the 9th prince? Edward King's eyes flickered with a trace of pain as he looked at Eleanor Bennet calmly. Your Highness, I do not understand your words. Eleanor Bennet, can you not see that Charles King is using you? Once you become a useless piece in his game, he will surely dispose of you. Edward King's gaze was filled with regret. He hadn't expected her to ultimately side with Charles King. Your Highness, Eleanor Bennet only follows orders and knows nothing beyond that. Eleanor Bennet firmly denied, uncertain if Edward King was merely acting in front of her. Very well. If you are uninvolved, then look out for yourself. I shall say no more. He will regret this decision. Eleanor Bennet understood his intentions. The emotions in his eyes might indeed be genuine. But to her, they held no value. Eleanor Bennet requested to leave, and as she did, she encountered Edward King stepping into the chamber. He gave her a cryptic smile, making her feel even more uneasy. Third brother, what are you planning? Edward King entered the inner chamber, taking a seat on a nearby armchair, observing Edward King lost in thought. Have someone keep an eye on Eleanor Bennet. The 9th prince is not the type to casually place an unrelated person near David King. Understood, third brother. Everything has been arranged. Fourth brother, once the records are obtained, kill David King. A murderous intent flashed across Edward King's face, carrying a faint coldness reminiscent of Charles King. And what about Eleanor Bennet? Edward King deliberately asked, wanting to know what place this woman truly held in Edward King's heart. Spare her life. Edward King hesitated, unable to harm her. He loved her deeply, to the point of soul exhaustion. Third brother, if she truly belongs to the 9 foxes, keeping her is a disaster waiting to happen. Edward King looked at his brother with concern. Fourth brother, even if I cannot have her heart, I must have her as a person. Edward King detected a murderous intent in his brother's words and warned him with a look. I understand, third brother. Edward King didn't want to ruin their brotherhood. Over a woman. After all, Eleanor Bennet, no matter how clever, was just a woman. Once she belonged to the third brother, what could she do? Eleanor Bennet left the Palace of Scenic Blossoms but didn't immediately return to the Imperial Medical Institute. Instead, she wandered in the Imperial Gardens, sensing danger creeping closer. Edward King was right. As soon as she became a discarded pawn, Charles King would silence her. Would Edward King do the same? Their nature was no different. Eleanor decided to carefully consider the matter of the ledger. If she couldn't have it, what would they do? She smiled slightly, a plan forming in her mind. Although this move was dangerous, it was undoubtedly a chance for survival in a dire situation. Chapter 28, A different kind of charm. Eleanor Bennet recalled a medicine her grandfather mentioned, which could render a person unconscious instantly without endangering their life, allowing them to awaken 3 days later. At the time, she thought it was just a joke and paid no mind. Now, it seemed useful. She wondered if this world had such an herb. Eleanor hurried back to the Imperial Medical Institute, drawing the herb from memory. Seeing her return safely, Daniel Moore sighed in relief. "Eleanor, why are you drawing the blood crow herb?" Daniel Moore recognized the herb under Eleanor's pen, known to cause instant paralysis upon contact with blood. "You say it's the blood crow herb?" Eleanor was delighted to find it existed, albeit under a different name. "Yes, it paralyzes instantly upon contact with blood and is very rare." Daniel looked at Eleanor with suspicion. "Daniel, do you know where to find it? I really need it." If he knew the name, he might know where to find it. 3 years ago, my master picked a branch. It's currently stored at Harmony Hall. Daniel, can you get it for me? Eleanor was slightly excited, grateful for his timely assistance. "Eleanor, what do you need it for?" Daniel asked curiously. "To save someone." Eleanor replied firmly with just 2 words. "All right, I'll go get it right away." Daniel didn't question further, suspecting it involved Charles King. Watching Daniel's figure disappear, Eleanor felt endless gratitude. If the world knew David King was dead, the coveted ledger would sink into oblivion. The cold night offered no sleep for Eleanor. She had a lead on the fake death potion, but convincing David King to trust her was a formidable challenge. Not to mention the difficulty of keeping it secret from the world. As she pondered, a shadow passed by, and she felt a chill at her neck. "Master Bennet, don't be afraid. I just need a small favor from you." The man in black tightened his grip, causing Eleanor Bennet to feel a sharp pain. "What do you want me to do?" Despite her fear, Eleanor Bennet tried to remain calm. "Take me to see David King," the man in black demanded. "You want to rescue him?" Eleanor Bennet glanced at him, trying to discern the face of the intruder. "That's none of your concern." The man in black's face was completely covered, making it impossible to see his features. Eleanor Bennet had a hunch that this person wasn't here to rescue David King but to kill him. The one behind David King couldn't wait any longer to silence him. "All right, I'll take you." Eleanor Bennet, unsure of how to gain David King's trust, found this interference surprisingly convenient. The man in black underestimated Eleanor Bennet, thinking she was just a weak woman, surprised by her composure. "However, dressed like that, you'll be caught before you even meet David King." Eleanor Bennet smirked. "Humph, don't try anything." The man in black pressed a pressure point on Eleanor Bennet and sheathed his sword. "Under that cabinet, there's a set of servant clothes. Go change." Eleanor Bennet instructed. The man in black followed her instructions, found the clothes, and changed immediately. He then released Eleanor Bennet's pressure point and held a broken blade to her back. "Don't try anything, or you'll face the consequences, Master Bennet," he warned. "I need to get the medicine box," Eleanor Bennet said, slowly moving to grab the box from the table, slipping a teacup into her sleeve as well. The two left the room, moving towards the courtyard where David King was held, under the faint moonlight. The guards were startled to see them and drew their swords cautiously. "Who goes there?" one guard asked. "It's me," Eleanor Bennet replied. The man in black subtly increased the pressure on her waist as a warning. "Master Bennet, why are you still up at this hour?" the guard questioned suspiciously. "I suddenly remembered an ancient remedy that might cure the crown prince, so I wanted to try it immediately. If it works, it'll be easier for me to report my progress," she explained. And who is he? The guard inquired, eyeing the man behind Eleanor Bennet. He's a new servant from the Imperial Medical Institute. Eleanor Bennet answered calmly. Very well, Master Bennet, you may enter. The guard allowed her into the room. Eleanor Bennet slowly entered and saw David King sitting on the bed, still with his usual vacant expression. You've seen him now, can you release me? Eleanor Bennet glared at the man in black behind her, wondering what his next move would be. Eleanor Bennet, who is he? David King felt the intense killing intent directed at him and decided not to feign madness any longer. Crown Prince, the Master always believes that only the dead can be trusted. Therefore, I was sent to escort you to the afterlife. The black-clad assassin finished speaking, and with a loud crash, Eleanor Bennet smashed the cup in her hand onto the ground. The shattering sound immediately alerted the guards outside. Eleanor Bennet, I underestimated you. The assassin realized he had been exposed and swiftly thrust his sword toward David King. Tonight, David King must die. Seeing the blade coming, Eleanor Bennet pushed David King aside, taking the assassin's strike herself.